form of governance. Others might term highly fragmented and incredibly irritating or whatever it is. Nonetheless, we have a lot of different ways that we manage resources, and water is a critical piece of that. And in addition to that, we move water all over the place, and we started doing it a long time ago before we started thinking about this integrated regional watershed management stuff and the multi-benefit stuff, right? We've been thinking about watersheds for a long time. Sometimes we've been thinking of make them connect and replumb them. That wasn't originally that way, but now we're trying to think about restoring watersheds, having multi-objective operating surface flows, groundwater, and so forth. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit here today, and how that fits into the overall idea of managing runoff. And in general, you can think about, we have sort of a scientific idea of what a watershed is. It's a drainage area for some segment of a river or river basin. You have sub-catchments within that, so sub-watersheds. Sometimes you see these called in hydrologic models and so forth. But we have lots of different ways that runoff happens, right? We have runoffs, and property owners are responsible for that runoff. And then you can think about it in terms of a block. We might want to do sort of a regional scale project in block by block area. Distributed infrastructure for water management in cities is thinking about this type of stuff. And then also cities, municipalities, chartered cities in California. They'll have particular jurisdiction over a realm, and they'll have taxing authority to build projects and so forth. And then you get up to that catchment scale and you get into more maybe, sometimes cities are bigger than catchments, sometimes catchments are around cities, usually catchments, I think, in terms of the larger cities of California, there's going to be a lot of than that. So for instance, down in LA, they subdivided the area into about 2,600 catchments within LA County. That's a lot of catchments, right? And then you have differences within a watershed planning area. So a watershed follows sort of where water runs off. But within a watershed kind of planning area, metropolitan, it might be rural and urban. It might be some mix of suburban in there as well. There might be protected lands and habitat and so forth. And so then finally, the whole mountains to ocean piece that we have here in California, where headwater runoff starts and moves all the way down to the ocean eventually, right? So across all these diverse landscapes, you have to figure out how groundwater connects with surface water and at what scale you're going to plan for that. And the idea since about 2002 is that you can have these sort of integrated regional areas that kind of self-agglomerate, sort of everybody gets together and you bring in all the stakeholders and you have a watershed planning area that then kind of you're piped up for grants and planning and getting conversations going and so forth. And that's all really good. But we have this whole other legacy way of organizing ourselves that comes from having municipalities and chartered cities. And then if you don't live in a municipality, you live in a county unincorporated area. Anybody live in a county unincorporated area that's not a municipality, right? So you're more or less, your county is you're going to be your service provider. But then you may not get your water from the county, from a county waterworks district. You may get it from an investor-owned utility, right? So now you have this whole other like private group that you have to bring into the company. And you might get your energy from a municipal electricity provider or something. So when you're talking about a multi-benefit project with greenhouse gas emissions and energy reductions and so forth, I mean, you have a room this big to get something done that's necessary to bring in all that. And those conversations take time and effort. And on top of that still, we have, oftentimes they're contiguous with counties, but special district areas which have some sort of jurisdiction to do some service, and they get taxation authority for it. And all this is basically to organize ourselves to do a few things: raise money, have infrastructure, provide utility services, and so forth. But here in California, it just happens on a lot of different scales, a lot of different operating conditions, and so you have to bring a lot of those people together at the table to get the multi-benefit project thing done. And what are the implications of this? So when you bring all these folks into a room, their particular agencies or nonprofit groups, companies and so forth might have a lot of different moving parts to try to put together, right? So you're going to have potentially different regulatory requirements at those different scales in the watershed. And you're going to have different state and local policies that might apply to whatever actions they need to undertake to check their boxes back in their home offices. And then you've also got who are the responsible parties, who's actually in control of stuff. Is it a resident in control of a yard? Is it the utility or the municipality in control of some area? And finally, what are the engineering, infrastructure, environmental, and management goals that they're sort of responding to? So when you folks in the room start talking, a lot of the early conversations, you might have someone talking over here, and someone talking over here, and someone talking over here, and over here, and over here, and kind of like trying to get all that together. And it takes a little while to pull that into one piece. And so the stormwater resource plan discussions we've had as partners, I think we've kind of seen some of that. And I was only there since October. Folks have been doing, in this room, been doing it a lot longer. But you kind of saw different discussions. You have municipalities that some are subject to municipal stormwater permits. Then you have folks interested in habitat, and folks interested in watershed scale plans, interested in potentially managing runoff differently that we are, and trying to pull all this together in kind of a region like the American River Basin ends up being a unique challenge, but it's not a challenge that's not being faced by municipalities or planning areas all throughout the state, right? And you see all the watershed planning goals. We saw some of these, and Greg mentioned these. I think you heard some of them this morning too. But this last one here is kind of a new piece of this. We're like zeroing in on it from a water management perspective, and I'll encourage for Graham Fogg's talk at the end because they'll really dig into this for the region, and it's really important. So how does managing runoff at the whole watershed perspective integrate all this stuff together, and how do we not have to be like LA or not have to be like San Diego, or how are we exactly like Humboldt or whatever? All these kind of discussions bouncing around as you're trying to integrate all this stuff together. So if we focus a little bit on the ARB, how you might think about the multiple scales of runoff for the American River Basin. From that list I had, I'll kind of zero in on basically two concepts, but this in kind of watershed and catchments. And I'd say a lot of this kind of stems from discussions we've had at OWP amongst all the folks in the room of just how this might fit together from a regional perspective. And we sort of throw it out there as some possible ideas, feedback, and so forth. So first off, we obviously have municipalities, right? And those municipalities need to respond to permit requirements that are instituted by the state and implemented by regional water quality control boards. And these will be related back to the Clean Water Act, right? So there has to be some sort of plan in place to meet the requirements that are instituted for your stormwater runoff. And stormwater runoff, amongst those three kind of pieces that Vice Chairman Moore talked about this morning: water supply, wastewater, and stormwater. Stormwater and flood control you kind of put together, but let's just talk about stormwater for a second. Stormwater is one into the game amongst trying to organize ourselves in the history of, let's say, the U.S. and how utilities kind of got together within municipalities, right? But we have been doing it for about 50 or 60 years now. And in the past couple of decades, we've seen this shift towards low-impact development. It's happened for a couple of reasons. One, we had a lot to pay for, and building new big infrastructure projects in cities was kind of difficult with land use requirements. And then also, in addition, you had the opportunity to at least start talking to designers and start talking to planners a little bit, because we wanted to pull this stuff together a little bit more. Obviously, we want to improve water quality. Now we're also thinking about stormwater as a resource, right? And so different parts of the state have different outlooks on this conversation. I work a lot in LA, where it's to get as much water into the ground in those groundwater basins as you can, right? And that's what they're working on doing. Up here, we got to remember the original purpose for managing stormwater is for water quality and to improve our watersheds. And I think Tim's presentation emphasized that this morning. And you get to that through kind of the watershed scale approach. And then moving away from cities, looking a little bit more at the watershed scale. As part of the Stormwater Resource Plan, we were kind of in tune with what some other parts of the state were doing. And there are some diverse regions like ours in terms of land use and in other parts of the state. And one of them is the Central Coast. So we took a look at what the Central Coast was doing. They have a nice document out, which I'll point you to, but I won't attempt to summarize it by any means, because the experts would be able to summarize this the best. But it's the methods and findings of the joint effort for hydromodification control in the Central Coast region of California. And this is Derek Booth and Darla Inglis and Stillwater Sciences. So what they did is they took a watershed scale approach and they divided up into these kind of management zones that you could align with best management practices. And I was mentioning this to a colleague of my former boss down at UCLA, who I still keep in touch with. Some of you might know Stephanie Pincel. She said, wow, that sounds a lot like Ian McHarg and Design by Nature, is it? And I said, I don't know. So I went inside. Luckily, I had the book. And sure enough, the designers had it 45 years ago. Go Claire. And looking at the landscape, how you divide it up, this is topography, this is geology, and this is hydrology, trying to overlay these maps. The cool thing now with GIS and technology, we can do this really fast, well, somewhat faster. You can do it more dynamically is the key, right? And you can use it as more of a dynamic planning tool, so you don't have a bunch of static maps laid all over the room. Instead, you can create web maps. And that's part of what we've done through the Stormwater Resource Plan. So we thought, all right, maybe we should look at this kind of watershed management as part of a planning to support the multiple ways you might think about this in our region. So with the help of, I know nothing about geology, so I just went over to Scott Meyer at our office and he helped me figure this stuff out. And Scott's over there. And we kind of looked and said, what does this mean for the American River Basin region? And so you can see here on this map, we've divided up on two main characteristics that influence runoff and slope and geology. And what does this do? It kind of gives you a high-level planning framework to think about it. If you're in essentially the valley here, below the foothills, you're in late sediment deposits. So you're going to be flat, you're going to maybe be more likely to accumulate. You have to think about the infiltration capacity of those soils. You might have clay underlinings and so forth. Then you have this sort of foothill area of a little bit earlier deposits of sediment. You kind of need site-specific information to really know what the infiltration capacity is here. You've got this group of metamorphic rock right here that's not great. And you see in some of the regional planning documents, you get a lot of shallow surface interflow, you'll call it, that moves from that area down into the valley. And this is obviously just kind of mimicking California runoff patterns in general, right? And then you got some granitic up here, up above Folsom Lake, and granitic could be a place where you get some fracture zones, so maybe super recharge down there potentially, but you have to go out and do the looks. And so this is kind of another layer that you can add on to the human and watershed characteristics for all this. And so if you kind of try to assemble all these map layers together, which is a bit of what we've been doing in the Stormwater Resource web map, you take a look and you have your municipal planning areas, municipal stormwater sewer systems. You have the watershed zones that I just showed you. Over at UC Davis, they put together a nice land use map for prioritizing recharge areas based on the kind of crop type and soil conditions and so forth. They call it SAGB. So Toby Ogeen was nice and shared that with us, and we've recreated some of that as well based on some data sets from the National Resources Conservation Service. So that's a SAGB layer. You could think about getting that recharge going depending upon your land use. And then you also have these critical habitat areas or protected zones or green area emphasized for species. Not to say that all parts of a river, creek bed or whatever aren't important for species, but these, there are some data sets out there that kind of have these maps all together. And then lastly, mentioned a little bit in our panel about disadvantaged communities. You have to think about the socioeconomics and trying to promote equity through these plans too, right? And so this is that you package on. So how do you put all these together? Luckily for us that do this, we haven't figured out some wicked algorithm as to yet to do it so that we all just have no jobs yet. This is still really hard work, and this is still really hard to put together. And so we're still well positioned in our realm to have work to do for a little while. So some quick takeaways. Plan here when you have matching geographic scales, if your municipality has water, stormwater, and wastewater all in-house. If it's not, then you have to start talking to others. When you have matching regulatory requirements and policy goals, right? So if you're both subject to the same set of policy requirements, then it's a little bit easier to get the conversation going. And also when you have streamlined funding, opportunity for streamlined funding, that helps too. If not, it's a lot of meetings, hotel, weekend hotel sessions, late night pizza, all this kind of stuff, right? And then finally, what's probably going to influence our conversations a little bit here for American River Basin, stormwater planning, runoff planning in this area. The stormwater capture and use idea, It was mentioned in Jing's presentation, this idea of reasonable assurance analysis, but essentially stormwater is a resource, and also the changing requirements around stormwater reasonable assurance analysis, how we do that permitting will have some effect in at least some areas. The managed aquifer recharge that you'll hear about, we're in the middle important place in the state. And so there's potentially some opportunities for that, but also we're going to be involved in some conversations probably, and we may not necessarily do the outreach on them, but we'll get pulled into them probably. And then finally, in-stream flows, coming off of Oroville or whatever, or Habitat, we've been working at this for decades, and I think that's certainly, it's certainly going to continue. So with that, the link to our web map, and we're kind of continually updating it as the resource plan is now on the street. So we've got some more layers. Also thinking about maybe a white paper to kind of put all this together, some advanced tools. And so we're kind of interested to hear what might be useful in that regard. And then if you want to get in touch, lots of ways to contact us and or my email address too. So thanks.
We have time for one or two questions.
Eric, do you see this linking up with the RWA's OPTI in putting this information together with OPTI so it will be available as we put projects in? Or is this going to be a standalone map that you would have just as a tool?
So I'll mention, but then I'm going to turn over to Maureen. The layers for that sort of management zones analysis, we'll probably detail that in some documentation and putting this together. But in terms of linking up with OPTI, I'll defer to Maureen on those discussions.
It's an idea. We haven't had that discussion with RWA. I mean, right now, the ARB web map, Stormwater Resource Plan web map, resides on the OWP website, and it'll be there indefinitely. And like Eric said, we're continuing to add more information to it as we have it. So it's an option. We'll have to talk with Rob.
Thank you very much, Eric. So in order to stay on time, we have a break. We still have, there's more tea over in the Klamath room. So please make sure that if during your break, if you need something, you can go over there, and it is still being webcast. We will reconvene in about 10 minutes, so we're just slightly behind, and we've left a little bit of a buffer. We have a great panel coming up for our last one, Efforts to Support Watershed RB Region. Maureen will be kicking it off. And as was mentioned, Graham Fogg is going to be one of our last speakers. He is teaching today and is on his way from UC Davis, so we will start our panel, and he'll be coming in towards the end of that. Oh, hi. Great, thank you. I wasn't sure if you had gotten here yet. So let's take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 5 till. We're going to try to get started here again. So if you take your seats, and if I can have the speakers for the last panel to go ahead and come up. Remind you that, again, we have water and tea in the other room. If you, the surveys that we had put out after lunch, when you fill those out, there's a box at the doorway in this room, and then there's also a box in the Klamath room. If you happen to be in there at the end of the day, we would appreciate those turned back in, and we appreciate your time. So with that, we'll go ahead and, oh, and the mixer, we can't forget about the mixer. So we have planned a time for you to network, and our sponsors are providing the food. So remember, it will start at it's a 4-block walk. In the rain, it's okay. And it's at Capitol Hop Shop. It is on I Street, 4 blocks east, and you can't miss it when you get to the corner of 14th and I.